Welcome back, everyone. I'm Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap expert, and I'm very excited to get into my 2024 NBA free agency primer. The finals just ended, so the unofficial start of free agency is now because teams can start talking to their current free agents. It's a new rule being added to the CBA. So I'm going to get into every team. I want to talk about how much they have to spend and any possible restrictions they might be subjected to. And then I want to go over the top 40 free agents and talk about what the general amount they could be looking at annually, and also just get into whether I think they are truly available or not, because free agency works a lot different nowadays. A lot of players are just extending or re-signing with their teams and worrying about getting to another destination later. And we could just see a lot more of players staying with their current teams. So without any further ado, let's get into it. And before I do, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you haven't already. So let's start with the cap space teams. And so far, I'm projecting 8 of them. We've got the Detroit Pistons, Philadelphia 76ers, Utah Jazz, Oklahoma City Thunder, Orlando Magic, Toronto Raptors. And then these last two, the San Antonio Spurs and Charlotte Hornets, they're kind of on the fringe, but as of now, I think that they will operate as cap space teams. So these teams, they have a lot of spending power. They can use their cap space to sign most free agents. They can use it to absorb players in trades. They have the most flexibility, and they're going to be able to do a lot of things. Now, I want to say that free agency has changed a lot over the past 5 or so years, where now players are more trending towards extending with their teams, resigning with them, and that is changing a lot of how the way cap space is used. Last offseason, more than half of it was used to absorb players in trades, not to so less than half of it was used to sign free agents in the traditional sense that you know. And given that about one, two, three, half of these, no, more than a little more than half of these teams are in a rebuilding situation right now, that could happen again, since these teams are probably going to be looking towards maybe asset accumulation, taking in some bad money with some draft picks attached. And by the way, all these projections that I'm about to go through, you can see them on capsheets.com. That's my website with all my salary cap sheets for each team. And you can even see for some of these, like the Pistons and Sixers, for example, I have certain criteria for some of these projections. It will say how I got to a certain amount, not like completely detailed, but it just says like what certain player is being factored in to get to that amount. But let's start with the Detroit Pistons. They have the most cap space right now. I project them at 64.4 million, and that projection includes them cutting Evan Fournier, Troy Brown, Chimezie Metu, and Stanley Umude. So roughly 8 players on the roster. They'd be able to spend that much, and then once they get to the cap, they can re-sign Simone Fontecchio. As for what they might do with the bulk of their cap space, I really don't know, because they just got a new front office, and before this front office came in, they were being linked to some veterans like Tobias Harris. Now I see them being linked to like Malik Monk and maybe Nick Claxton, those types of guys, or a little younger, but it's really unclear what they're gonna do. One thing I could maybe see them doing, I talked about in my Pelicans video, maybe they want to try to get a good veteran, but make sure they also get like a draft pick attached. One player that came to mind was CJ McCollum, especially because now they're bringing over all these people from the Pelicans, so maybe there's some interest there. But yeah, I really don't know what they're gonna do with their cap space, and I wouldn't be shocked if they don't really do anything with it, because they could roll over max cap space into next offseason, because their biggest move that we know they're likely going to do is extend Cade Cunningham, and he could get a max contract. But even if he gets it, they could still have some max cap space next offseason if they don't add any long-term money for this upcoming offseason. All right, the Philadelphia 76ers, by far, they're going to have the most fascinating offseason. I mean, we'll see if it actually plays out the way they hope, but just going into the offseason, for sure the most fascinating team to keep an eye on. So I'm projecting them right now with just under 54 million, and that factors in them having Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, and still having some of those non-guaranteed players like Paul Reed, Jeff Dowden, Ricky Council, and they have their first round pick. I think it's more realistic. They're looking at around 57 million if they cut some of those guys like Dowden and Council, and they can get a maximum of $65 million if they cut everyone, including Paul Reed, and also trade out of their first round. And that could be more than enough for them to sign a guy like Paul George, someone that they've been heavily linked to. And so definitely watch my Sixers video. I get really into all the different scenarios they could get into. And for example, if they were to sign Paul George, that's most of their cap space, leaves enough for maybe one more starter. And then they got to use that $8 million room exception to try to get one other guy. And then the rest of the roster will mostly be minimums. But if they were to get a cheaper max player like a Brandon Ingram, for example, then you still have enough room to bring in a lot more role players and get a little more depth. So very interesting offseason to keep an eye on, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully things play out well for them. Utah Jazz, I'm currently projecting them with $33 million in cap space with about 13 players on the roster. I don't expect them to do too much. I think the most anticipated move for them is potentially renegotiating and extending Lauri Markkanen's contract. So right now he's got an $18 million expiring contract, and there's an expectation that they'll use their cap space because he's eligible for this since he's in the third year of a 4-year contract, where they can use their cap space to increase that $18 million salary and then give him an extension off of that. So theoretically, they can put his salary up to the max, which would require about $23 million in cap space, I believe, to bring his salary to $42 million. And then they can give him like an additional 4 years, 200 something million. And if they do that, they wouldn't have that much cap space left. They'd have about 10 million left, which I guess at that point they'd use towards salary dump, just taking in some bad money and getting some draft picks as well. I think they're still very much in an asset accumulation mode. OKC, $33 million in cap space with 13 players so far. And probably second most fascinating offseason behind Philly because OKC is a contender and they're in this unprecedented situation where they can go after another guy. I think ideally they want to get another forward, some more size. They've been linked to a couple, they've been linked to getting a big man like Isaiah Hardenstein. Although I don't know, I'm not sure about that. OKC generally keeps things pretty close to the vest, so it's rare for the things like this to leak and then they actually fall through. And getting someone like that. But watch my OKC video. I talked about this scenario, which I doubt will happen, in which they acquire Lauri Markkanen and then use cap space to also renegotiate him 6 months after getting him. It probably won't happen. He's going to stay in Utah. But yeah, they're gonna be able to get someone, and whoever they get, the most likely scenario is that it's on a 1 or 2 year deal, because then in 2 years you're gonna have to pay Jalen Williams and Chet Holmgren, and once that happens, the roster gets very expensive. It's gonna be very hard to pay all three of them, Shea, Dort on his pretty decent deal, and then have another guy making a lot of money. And they don't have to use their cap space this year, kind of like Detroit. If they don't use it, they can roll it over into 2025 as well. They'd have also about 33 million in cap space or so. Orlando, they have about 33 million in cap space with 12 players under contract. They can get up to 67 million in cap space, but that would require them cutting Jonathan Isaac, which I don't see happening. Mo Wagner, also don't see happening, and Joe Ingles. I could see that one happening, $11 million team option. So if they decline that, they can get to about 44 million cap space, which would be pretty close to the max that they can potentially sign Paul George to. They've been linked to him, also more than enough for Klay Thompson, another guy they've been linked to. Kind of like OKC, another team that generally operate pretty secretly. Their biggest moves will come out of nowhere, like Vucevic. So I don't expect either of those players to actually go to the Magic. I do think though that they need to prioritize, those types of players, some shooting and wing and spacing, but more younger players that fit their timeline. And I think those players are mostly available for trade. But I do think that they're probably going to have to do something this summer with their cap space, because they have Franz Wagner and Jalen Suggs are extension eligible, and they'll have new deals presumably kicking in next season. And once that happens, their cap space is gone. And the Magic have been pretty unaggressive in the past few years with cap space. They could have had cap space the last two off seasons, and they technically did, but didn't go after anyone with it, so to speak. And this is going to be their last window to do that sort of thing. Okay, Toronto. So they're also kind of on the fringes because of some recent reporting. So I've got them projected at $30 million in cap space with 11 players, and that factors in them being able to re-sign Emmanuel quickly. So they could spend that 30 million and then re-sign quickly afterwards. But that also factors in them declining Bruce Brown's $23 million team option. And there's been some recent reporting that the Raptors want to pick it up for trade purposes. But we'll see what happens. But like I said, I would probably decline it. See if you could bring him back. Otherwise, use that extra 30 million for more asset accumulation. They need to try to get more draft picks, more assets, just taking some unwanted expirings and more draft picks. The Spurs, I've got them at 21 million, but it's basically a full roster, 14 players. That includes them waiving Devontae Graham and Charles Bassey. And they don't have any major free agents other than Cedi Osman, which, not really like a major priority for them. And I'm guessing, though, with whatever cap space they have left, they just use it to take in more bad money and draft picks. They were going to have closer to like 30 million in cap space, more like 27, but then they ended up keeping the Raptors pick this year, which was a little unexpected. So that bit into their cap space projection quite a bit. And I just don't see them rushing things, trading for a veteran guard. They've been linked to guys like Darius Garland, Trae Young. I just don't see them doing that. I think they're going to keep things slow, as good as Victor Wembanyama already is, and just continue building through the draft and the process they started. All right, and then Charlotte. Their situation also very fluid, and it's mainly because of Miles Bridges. So I project them with just under $20 million in cap space with a full 15-man roster, which doesn't include Bridges. But they can get to that much while keeping him in the fold. So they could spend about 20 million and then re-sign him afterwards because he has a pretty low $15 million cap hold that's interfering with their cap space. If he leaves, then that projection could nearly double to closer like 35 million cap space. So that keep in mind that projection also includes them. Both those projections include them cutting guys like Seth Curry, Alexei Pokusevsky, Bryce McGowan, JT Thor. So if he's brought back, very good chance maybe they do it early on and they don't even use for cap space because it's not much cap space nowadays. All right, now it's the next tier spenders. These are the teams that won't have cap space. They're over the salary cap, but they are well below the first or second apron level. So they're going to be between cap space and apron level. So these teams will mainly have the non-tax pyramid level exception projected at $12.9 million and the biannual exception projected at $4.7 million as their biggest means for spending. Now, a couple of things. One, a lot of these teams might not even end up using these exceptions. They could use their flexibility to increase their payroll through trades. Some of these teams are already pretty close to the luxury tax line. They might not want to exceed it for the season and might not really do much spending at all. And then another thing to note is some of these teams, they might not have, they might be over the first or second apron right now, but I'm just gonna go ahead and predict that they will get below it. A couple of these teams are like Portland, Atlanta, but yeah, let's get into it. I'll start with Atlanta. So as of now, they are slightly over the first apron. That's mainly thanks to the lottery. They shot up all the way to number one, and they were already pretty close to the tax. And because of this, they really don't have any exceptions for spending. They have some big trade exceptions, like a $23 million one, for example. But I think at this point, there's a good chance it goes unused unless they make a really big cost savings move. So I'm expecting them to reduce their payroll. They've done so every year in the past 2 years. Like when they brought in DeJounte Murray, they immediately traded Kevin Huerter. And when they then last year they were having a tax crunch, they salary dumped John Collins. And I think they're going to go ahead and try to make that move ahead of time. Ideally, it would probably be DeAndre Hunter, especially so they could bring back Sadiq Bey. But I think it could also be Clint Capella. He's expiring, definitely more of a hot commodity. maybe they just salary dump him to create that flexibility, especially since the number one pick could end up being Alex Sarr, who's another center. Plus, they already have Okongwu. Uh, as far as their direction, it's kind of unclear. You've heard all the rumors, maybe Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, they end up trading them. I think they end up keeping Trae Young for now. Maybe they move DeJounte Murray to some of the teams he's been linked to, like the Lakers or Pelicans, try to save some money, more money there. But I think that most likely they, aside from potentially bringing back Sadiq Bey, they don't really do much. I don't think they're, other than a trade, I don't think they're going to use these spending exceptions to increase their payroll. All right, the Brooklyn Nets. So they have a lot of different spending exceptions. They've got the non-taxpayer, then biannual, and they've also have several big trade exceptions, including a $20 million amount and a $19.9 million amount, another $20 million amount especially. So they've got flexibility. They can spend, they can use these exceptions to trade and increase their payroll. They are $37 million below the tax with 11 players right now. They're not going to want to exceed the luxury tax this season, especially considering how bad they were last year. And that flexibility, a good chunk of it will go towards re-signing Nick Claxton. Check out my Brooklyn Nets video for more detail about what the Nets could do. I mainly get into how they're still trying to pursue an all-star via trade, and then I compare it to the rebuilding path, just like as a hedge where if things don't work out, maybe you get some of your draft picks back in a trade with Houston involving Mikal Bridges, and at least you're building something towards there in case you don't get another all-star. But I can see them really not using any spending exceptions. I think they're going to preserve it in their attempts to keep their flexibility open in case they got to increase payroll in the trade. If a big all-star becomes available, then they're going to need to increase their payroll. And once they re-sign Claxton, they might have like somewhere between 10 to 15 million left below the tax. So not too much. Again, I'm skeptical they'll even have those type of opportunities, but as far as depth goes, they are pretty good at getting good vets on the minimum. It's definitely one of their biggest like skills, I guess. They just get like Dennis Smith Jr. and Lonnie Walker on the minimum. So I expect them to fill out their depth that way. So the Chicago Bulls seem like they are going to run things back yet again. And their biggest free agent is DeMar DeRozan, who it seems like they want to keep. And they are currently about 36 million below the luxury tax with 12 players. And re-signing him could very well put them very close to the tax. And that their other major free agent is Patrick Williams. I would guess that just, maybe they want to bring him back. He'll be restricted. He'll have I believe, a $13 million qualifying offer. But if they're going to bring back DeMar under this current payroll, they probably won't have room for Patrick Williams. They're not going to want to exceed the $171.3 million luxury tax either. One thing I could see them potentially try to do, one, Zach LaVine's available. You could try to reduce payroll through trading him, but I just don't see any market for him right now. I don't think it's changed, and the injury certainly didn't help. Lonzo Ball, he's now an expiring contract, $21.4 million salary. So that one's a little more movable. Maybe they look to trade him to a cap space team or just to another team where they just reduce payroll, try to get a little more flexibility if they really care about bringing back both DeMar DeRozan and Pat Williams. Maybe they could attach the number 11 pick with Lonzo Ball in a trade where like they swap it for a much lower selection in this year's draft. I don't know, just an idea I had. By the way, I don't expect the Bulls to use their spending exceptions either unless they could significantly reduce payroll, and that's beyond the Lonzo Ball trade. Maybe they could also get off Javon Carter or even a combination of a Zach LaVine trade or Nikola Vucevic trade as well. Cleveland Cavaliers, they are roughly $10 million below the luxury tax line with 12 players on their roster. A lot could change depending on what happens with Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, Jared Allen, but it seemed all indications are that those guys are going to remain at least to start the season. And assuming that's the case, they basically have limited amounts of ways to increase their payroll. They could use for mid-level exception to bring in another guy, but probably not the full amount. Alternatively, they have Isaac Okoro. He is their most significant free agent. He'll be restricted, $13 million qualifying offer. I would try to bring him back. But they could also just not use the exception at all, not re-sign Okoro, and just keep that their their flexibility open in case a trade comes where they need to increase their payroll. But I do think if they make a major trade, they're more likely to decrease payroll, such as if they trade Darius Garland. They'll very good chance they decrease their payroll, getting off his $37 million salary. So the Golden State Warriors, I just did a video about them. Check them out. I talk about how they can they're gonna have some financial relief for the first time in a while. They're probably not gonna be in the tax for the first time in 3 or 4 years. They spent nearly $700 million in tax penalties alone over the past decade. And now that they swapped out Jordan Poole's contract for Chris Paul, who's non-guaranteed, they're presumably going to cut him, who has no money owed to him. And it's also reported that Kevon Looney will probably get cut as well. They're in a position to duck the tax while fielding the roster. So I've got them roughly $32 million below the tax, assuming they cut Paul and Looney, and that is more than plenty enough to re-sign Klay Thompson and field the rest of the roster. Then, they don't really have any other major free agents besides Lester Quinones. I think I would definitely see what, he's restricted. Maybe they could bring him back on a nice, long-term minimum-ish type deal. But besides that, they do have the mid-level exception available to them. They could use it, but very likely under this payroll structure, assuming Gary Payton returns, that they will exceed the tax if they use that entire amount. So I'm kind of skeptical they'll end up using it unless they make another big cost-cutting move, maybe by trading Andrew Wiggins, who I do talk about. I think with Jonathan Kuminga being extension eligible, that Wiggins will be on his way out eventually. It doesn't have to be now, could be next season. But if they do it now, you could open up more flexibility to use that exception if there's someone you really like there. Houston, very interesting offseason. I did a very thorough video about them and their upcoming situation because they're going to be trying to make some upgrades on the trade market. I've got them $14 million below the tax with 13 players, so they can easily just use the entire exception if they'd like. However, I think they're going to keep that flexibility open for trades. I talk about in my video how they can go after a guy like Donovan Mitchell or someone more cheaper like Mikal Bridges. They've got the assets, they got the draft picks, got the young players to get it done, and they're gonna have they can have up to $60 million in cap space next offseason to really push things if one of these players ever wanted to join them. But if nothing happens, there's just so little all-stars available that everyone wants to get, and very often they're not available. Houston could alternatively just use the mid-level exception. One thing they could do is sign a role player to a contract only the first year's guaranteed, and then they have multiple years non-guaranteed. They did that with Jock Landale last offseason, and he's got 3 more years at $8 million each that are non-guaranteed. And they did this for trade purposes. So if the Rockets ever do make some big or just any significant trade this offseason, very good chance it involves him or Jeff Green, since their contracts were designed in this way to be traded. Okay, so Indiana, by the time this goes up, very good chance that Pascal Siakam is resigned, or more so, there's an agreement between him and the Pacers on a new deal. But either way, once he's resigned, he's going to have the same $42 million-ish salary as Tyrese Halliburton. They are going to be about $20 million below the tax with just 11 players. That also factors in Jalen Smith opting out, which there is some reporting. My guy Michael Scotto and Hoops Hype reported that there's a good chance that happens. So with that $20 million in flexibility, they're not going to want to exceed the luxury tax. That should be enough for them to re-sign Obi Toppin. If he doesn't return, they could just use the mid-level exception instead to bring back someone else, but they can't use both. I talked about in my Pacers video. Make sure you watch that. I think ultimately try to bring back Toppin. It's unlikely they get anyone as good as him with the mid-level exception. All right, Memphis, another team kind of like Atlanta and Portland where they're currently over the first apron, but I highly expect them to get below it. They can easily do it by declining Luke Kennard's $14.8 million team option, and they could get another boost with Yuta Watanabe. He's expected to decline his $2.7 million player option and he's going to go overseas. So that would put them pretty well below the first apron and the luxury tax line. So they could comfortably use the mid-level exception if they'd like, but the roster's already pretty deep. They'll have 13 players left over, and the rotation is pretty set when the team is fully healthy, which was not at all the case last year. And they're, as far as needs, they mainly need a center, which there's so many ways they can get him. They can get one pretty easily. They could trade for a guy like Clint Capella or someone even cheaper like Kevon Looney. They can acquire one with the mid-level exception, maybe like a Precious Achua. They can even draft one. They got the 9th overall pick. They should have options there. Plenty of centers in the draft. So I don't expect too much from them, and I don't expect them to try to pursue any major trades. If they do any trades, maybe just try to save some more money, maybe trade some guys that aren't really in the rotation just to clear even more flexibility. But once they get below the first apron, they also have some trade exceptions that they'll open up. Like they have this $12.6 million one that they generated from trading Steven Adams last year. New Orleans Pelicans, I've got them $14 million below the tax with 13 players. But keep in mind, they have no center right now. Jonas Valanciunas expired, and it seems like they might just let him go. They want a more rim protective type center, like Jared Allen. Ideally, that would be their dream target. Unclear if he's going to be available. I did a video about them. Make sure to watch that. I went in depth about what they could end up doing. They could, mainly because it seems like they could really shake things up by moving significant money. They can trade Brandon Ingram, who is they're unlikely to offer him a max extension, and they want to elevate Trey Murphy. That's a big factor in that decision. And I would also they want to get a new point guard. They've been linked to guys like DeJounte Murray, Darius Garland, Trae Young. And if they bring him in, then they just can't have CJ McCollum on the roster. So I went into scenarios about how they could really just restructure their payroll while getting these upgrades at point guard and center by moving both those guys. No matter what, though, they're not going to exceed the tax. They never have in the history of their franchise. And with that said, even if they do have this extra flexibility left over, if they get some cost-effective options at point guard, at center, I still don't think they'd use the mid-level exception. If they have some extra money to spend, I think they're more likely to re-sign Najee Marshall. He's been penciled as a guy likely to leave, but if they can clear enough space below the tax, I'm sure they'd love to bring him back. So I've got Portland with a 16-man roster, and they are just slightly over the first apron. So I fully expect them to get below it. It just makes no sense to operate as a first apron team in this rebuilding situation. But they just got such a high payroll. They've got 4 players making over $20 million. And they'll get below it somehow. It's just a matter of who they're trading. Like if they were, maybe a team wants Robert Williams, want to buy low on him, or Matisse Thybulle, those guys make $11-12 million. Maybe they give away Malcolm Brogdon. I don't know how much they can get for him. Or they might have to part with someone like a Jeremy Grant or Anthony Simons, a more coveted type player. They can get some draft picks for them and maybe save a lot of money that way. But their whole situation is just kind of a mess right now with their payroll. I don't know what spending they could possibly do, if any. Just depends on how much they can reduce their payroll first. Sacramento, I have them with 12 players on the roster, 16 million below the tax. So payroll's adding up pretty quickly. I talked about them. Make sure to watch that video. I talked about how their free agency basically hinges on Malik Monk and how they can bring him back. And if he leaves, they can open up a little more flexibility, either for the mid-level exception or to maybe make a bigger trade. So if they re-sign Malik Monk, they are pretty much going to be right at the tax. Probably get over it once they fill out the rest of the roster. So in my video, I talked about how they could also reduce payroll in general, regardless of what happens. Because between Sasha Vezenkov, Davion Mitchell, Chris Duarte, they don't really need those guys. They're all making up combined $18-19 million off the bench. So maybe they could look to offload them, get even more flexibility for spending and towards keeping Monk and avoiding the tax. And one of the teams I talked about as a potential trade partner for the Kings and these potential cost-cutting moves for them is the Wizards, because they are a pseudo cap space team. And what I mean by that is that they have all these big trade exceptions. They have one worth 12.4 million, 9.8 million, 5.4 million. So they can theoretically do trades where they're taking in a bunch of salaries, and they just absorb them and try to get some assets attached. They generated all these different trade exceptions over the past year through the Beal and Porzingis trade and whatever trades kind of happen after that. But they are about 25 million below the tax with 15 players. They can get a little more flexibility by simply cutting Landry Shamet, $11 million non-guaranteed. They could also trade some guys that have interest from around the league, like Kyle Kuzma or Denny Avdia, or Landry Shamet as well. And I just note that because they're not going to want to be taxpayers this year, but they have one significant free agent, Tyus Jones, who I would guess they're going to try to bring back, unless they can get a good sign and trade package for him. But yeah, just them, very interesting. I don't think they'll use their spending exceptions to try to improve the roster. Just try to use them for facilitating more salary dumps and asset accumulation. All right, here's the next tier of over the cap teams. These are the ones that are projected to be over the first apron but below the second one. Not a very big group. And here are where the restrictions start to get into play. And I wrote them down. So mainly as far as a trade, I think this is the biggest one. They cannot take in more salary in a trade than they're sending out. If you're below the first apron and you do that, you're hard capped to the first apron, which is projected at $178.7 million this year. Conversely, if you're already above the first apron, you cannot take in more salary in the trade. So because they're over the first apron, they don't have the biannual exception, and their mid-level exception is reduced to the $5.2 million taxpayer mid-level amount, which could only go for 2 years. And if they go into the season over the first apron, they cannot sign a player who gets bought out who had a pre-waiver salary that was worth a $12.9 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception or above. And they can't use old trade exceptions. If they had some rolled over from the previous year, they can't use it. That's why I was saying for Atlanta, for example, as of now, they can't use their trade exceptions until they get below the first apron. So Dallas, they are currently over the tax, and they're pretty close to the first apron. That I'm considering them operating above the first apron. I just did a video about them, and I mainly talk about how they could bring back Derrick Jones Jr., and that would mainly require them reducing payroll, likely through a Tim Hardaway Jr. trade, so they can open up the non-taxpayer mid-level exception to sign him, maybe not to the full amount, but pretty close to it. And if he doesn't return, they could alternatively trade Tim Hardaway Jr. for another wing replacement when they still have 2 first-round picks available. So pretty simple offseason, but I am expecting them as of now to probably be over the first apron, but depending on how things go, they could potentially get slightly below it mid-season or in a trade now and even get below the tax. So the Lakers, their situation is very fluid right now, mainly because of the player options for LeBron James and D'Angelo Russell. But in the most likely scenarios that they return, whether they opt in or opt out and resign on new deals, they are probably going to be over the first apron. So currently they have 13 players, and they have some other pending player options as well. But with their payroll structure, they are above the first apron. And upgrading the roster will be tricky. I did a video on them. Watch that. I talk about how they could potentially trade for some of the all-star guards they've been linked to, which I don't think it will happen. But it'll be interesting to see how they navigate the roster, because they could use the taxpayer mid-level exception while staying below the second apron. That's the thing. If you're going to use that exception, then you can't go above the second apron, which I don't think the Lakers want to do anyways. But they can't, trade. It's going to be difficult upgrading the roster because they can't really increase payroll in a trade. So Miami, they are above the first apron and just slightly below the second, and I'm expecting things to kind of stay that way. So they have 13 players on the roster with that projection, but that includes Caleb Martin. He's got a $7.1 million player option, which I fully expect him to decline, which will bring them a little closer to the first apron. I think they're going to do nothing for the most part. I think, kind of like last year, just sign some minimum guys and try to find some more undrafted players out of nowhere that can fit into the rotation. But mainly, even if they open up more flexibility through Martin leaving, or other players getting traded, I think they're going to keep their flexibility open for potential trades. In case Donovan Mitchell becomes available to them, or even Damian Lillard, who they were going after last year until he didn't come. If those guys become available, they're going to need to stay above the first apron while fielding the rest of the roster, but also stay below the second apron. So I would expect them to just kind of see how things play out. Maybe they could get in the mix for another All-Star. Okay, and then the New York Knicks. This one's a little bit speculative. A very fluid situation, mainly because of their top free agents, OG Anunoby and Isaiah Hartenstein. I'm assuming both are returning, and if they do, the Knicks will very likely be above the first apron, and they'll do their best to stay below the second apron. So in my Knicks video, I talked about them a couple weeks ago, still very relevant today. I talk about some payroll projections of how the payroll could be if OG Anunoby and Isaiah Hartenstein come back, but that also includes them keeping Bojan Bogdanovic in his $19 million expiring contract, but they can easily waive him. It's partially guaranteed, and that could keep them below the first apron and even get in a position for them to avoid the tax. But they are in the market for a star player, and if they want to trade for one, they gonna trading Bojan's contract would help a lot towards the salary matching. Otherwise, you're gonna have to trade a valuable rotation piece like Josh Hart, for example. But the team is going to be pretty expensive either way, and I wouldn't expect many moves beyond re-signing their guys, which could very likely mean that Precious Achiuwa will not return. And then the final tier, the second apron teams, these are the highest spenders. They are gonna be well over the tax, and they are subjected to the most team building restrictions. So I wrote them down. Let's just go through them really quickly. Everything that I mentioned that first apron teams are restricted to, this applies to them as well. And a couple other things. One, they cannot combine players' salaries in a trade to get a more expensive guy, aka aggregation. You're not allowed to do that. If you do that while you're below the second apron, you're hard capped to it, can't exceed it. If you're above it, you can't combine players in a trade, period. You can't send out cash in trades. And by the way, as far as these two particular trade restrictions, they apply now. You don't have to wait till July for it to happen. If a team does these things now in June, like during the draft, for example, then they are hard capped to the second apron. And likewise, they prevented a loophole from teams that are already projected to be over the second apron from doing these things now. So if a team like the Celtics, for example, wanted to aggregate players, they can't because they're already projected to be over the second apron in the following season. They can't sign and trade free agents in exchange for players. So they could still sign and trade their own free agents, but like for draft picks, to bring in cash, things that don't count against the cap. But if they wanted to sign and trade their own free agent to acquire another player on an existing contract, or another free agent to sign and trade coming back, that's not allowed. Likewise, you cannot generate a trade exception from trading your free agent in a sign and trade. And then the last thing is no spending exceptions of any kind. What does that mean? You don't even have the taxpayer mid-level exception. First apron teams don't have the big mid-level or the biannual, and then these second apron teams won't even have the taxpayer mid-level exception. Their biggest means for signing players is the minimum contract, which you can sign a player to a minimum contract for 1 or 2 years. Signing your draft picks, there's no cap on that, and re-signing your own players. So let's start with the Boston Celtics, the champions. They are already over the second apron next year with 13 players. So they're only going to be able to add minimum players. They don't have any significant free agents. I mean, they have Xavier Tillman, but I don't expect them to bring him back. Great insurance policy in the finals, but I think he's going to get pretty significant offers the Celtics will not match. And then there's also Shea Brissett, got that player option, $2.5 million. Good chance he declines that for more playing time elsewhere. But I have them about $5.4 million with over the second apron with this 13 player roster. And the interesting thing is this Drew Holiday extension they did. When I heard he signed for 4 years, 135, I thought, okay, he's in his mid 30s going to age into his late 30s with his contract. Why not front loaded? Why not start at like high 30s and end it at the low 30s? And the reason they did that, they didn't do that. They're starting it at $30 million this year. Then it's going to go up, is because they are close enough to the second apron where they could potentially get below it this upcoming season. And that's important because one thing I didn't write down as far as restrictions, it's not really a restriction, more like a second apron penalty, is that if you finish the season over the second apron, you have your draft pick 7 years out in the future frozen. You no longer can trade it. And there is a way you can get it unfrozen, but you have to stay below the second apron for multiple years. And if you stay over the second apron again, then that same draft pick will drop to the end of the first round. And, I think ideally, if you can avoid that, you want to. You don't want to have your future draft pick devalued because of something you did 7 years ago. And so, roughly 5-6 million above the second apron, they could easily get below it later. The name that's on the cap sheet that easily comes to mind is Peyton Pritchard. They could salary dump his $7 million, or they can do something like Jaden Springer, $4 million, and two other players around the trade deadline making the minimum. That could get them below the second apron. So the Denver Nuggets, I've got them slightly over the second apron with 14 players, but that's factoring in Contavious Caldwell-Pope's player option right now, which he's probably going to decline, and he's going to probably get a raise in a longer deal that could put them deeper into the second apron this year. Lots of speculation about what his contract could look like. Teams like the Sixers or Magic, for example, could maybe make a front-loaded offer to him to steal him from the Nuggets. But let's say he gets like $20 million. They could still get below the second apron later with a Zeke Naji dump, or maybe a combination of getting off Reggie Jackson's $5 million as well. And I think those draft pick penalties, it matters. I don't think they're going to want to have them because they're already out so many future draft picks that they're going to need them, especially because the way they're building their team, they're investing heavily in the draft to sustain this window for as long as possible. Okay, the Clippers, their situation is very fluid, mainly because of Paul George and James Harden's free agency coming up, but I'm just going to go ahead and assume that they're both back. The Clippers just can't afford to lose those guys. They won't have any flexibility to replace them if either one of them leave. And the Clippers, I'm guessing they're going to bring them back. And if they do that, they're going to be above the second apron. They're going to be pretty deep into it. It's going to be very hard for them to get below it later. So they'll be deep into the tax again, probably like a $300 million plus payroll and luxury tax payment combined. They're not going to have any flexibility to do anything else. Just sign minimum players. Not a lot of significant free agents that they have. And in my Clippers video, you can watch that. I talk about how I think that even if they bring back these guys, doesn't necessarily mean that they're really trying to keep the team together for the long term. Could be more of an asset move where you bring these guys back because you can't afford to lose them, and maybe just pivot as soon as you can. Try to get some flexibility to rebuild the next team and some draft assets for trades later. Milwaukee Bucks. So very tough situation, I think, for them. They are slightly below the second apron at the moment with 11 players. So once they get to 14, they're going to exceed it. However, I could see them avoiding the second apron. They could get below it by dumping a guy like Bobby Portis, $12.6 million salary, or Pat Connaughton, $9.4 million salary. Their roster, though, basically roster moves are limited to minimum signings. Their most significant free agents are Patrick Beverley, Jay Crowder, but I think they fit the criteria of minimum players at this point. It'll be tough. That's a situation that I'm definitely monitoring because, they got thwarted by injuries last year, but if with just given how limited things are and how aging the core is starting to age a little more, I wonder if things could change in the near future there. All right, Minnesota, the team that many people were speculating are gonna have to make some type of cost-cutting move unless they make a deep run, and they did it. So they're gonna run this team back, in my opinion. Right now, about $7 million above the second apron with 11 players. So they're going to be probably more like 14 million above it once they fill out the roster. No major free agents besides Kyle Anderson, who's worth more than the minimum. But maybe they don't bring him back to save money because their payroll is going to be at least $80 million once they fill out the roster. the tax penalty, that is. And the only way to potentially get below the second apron is by trading one of their top 6 highest paid players, which include Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, Mike Conley. I don't think the Wolves want to move either one of these players right now, and you shouldn't. Just based on the run you just had, you got to keep all these guys together and run it back. So aside from potentially re-signing Kyle Anderson, probably just minimum signings from here on. And then last and certainly not least, the Phoenix Suns, who are probably going to have the highest payroll in the league this upcoming season and the highest luxury tax payment probably in history. So as of now, they are 20 million above the second apron. They're not going to get below it unless they trade one of their top guys like Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, which seems like that's not happening anytime soon. And they currently have a $330 million roster with 12 players. And it's only going to go up because they're expected to re-sign Royce O'Neal. And once they do that and get the 14 players, that's going to cost another $100 million in payroll and tax penalties combined. So I did a video about them. Make sure to watch that. I mainly just talk about that because of how limited they are. I just project their payroll. You can see how it gets to 400 million plus, but also just talk about how they're kind of stuck. They don't have any assets left. There's not much else they could do. And I feel like this kind of might be the last year for them. But as far as other moves they could do, they do have 2 draft picks left, 2025 and 2031 first round pick. Maybe they look to package it with Yusuf Nurkic, try to get a cheaper, better fitting center, ideally a better rim protector who can fit Mike Budenholzer's system better, and maybe another depth piece. But other than that, yeah, they're like the most restricted and penalized team from this group. And now is the part where I'm going to go over my top 40 free agents. I am going to tier them in terms of how much I expect them to get annually in their contracts this summer. So I'm going to touch on each one, and I'll also go over if I think they're really available or not, because the nature of free agency has changed so much, like I mentioned at the beginning, where players are trending more towards resigning, extending with their team. So I'm going to go through each one. And here's the first tier, 35 million and up, which is essentially max player zone, because you got 3 different tiers of max contracts, and the lowest one, the starting salary starts at around $35 million in the first year, averages about $40 million over the course of the deal. So LeBron James, he's got a couple options. Mainly he can opt out of his deal and he can resign for up to 3 years with the Lakers for $162 million, or he can opt in to it's like $51 million player option, and then he can extend, I believe, in August for an additional 2 years. And the money's pretty similar over that 3-year period. It's like slightly more than the opt-out path. I think he's probably going to opt out because it's just the more likely scenario, and it just gives him a little more leverage, puts a little more pressure on the Lakers to do some things in the offseason. And so, yeah, 160-ish over 3. What is that? Roughly 50, mid-50s over the course of the deal. So, yeah, he'll be making well into the 50s. Paul George, same thing. He'll probably be making well over 50, close to like 60 million annually. So he can opt out as well, and he can just leave the Clippers. He could sign with a cap space team like Philadelphia, a team he's been heavily linked to. He can also extend right now with the Clippers if he wants. If maybe if the Clippers either up their offer to that 4-year deal versus the 3 years that they're currently offering him, which is the same as what they just gave Kawhi Leonard. He can also potentially opt in and extend with them, or even get traded he'd have more different options. If he wanted to leave the Clippers, he can go to several other types of over the cap teams. They can do a traditional type of trade for him. Is he available? In a way, I guess so, but I guess we'll see. There was a report that the Clippers want to call his bluff over his desire to, or not desire, but willingness to leave LA. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. A real showdown going on between the two. I don't think there's much to touch on with Tyrese Maxey. I already mentioned him earlier. He's going to get his max contract with the Sixers, 5 years, $205 million, so a little over $40 million a year. And the Sixers just they'll spend all their cap space and then re-sign him to it. Pascal Siakam, another guy, maybe by the time this video's out, he'll have had his deal reported. I think it's a max level deal. The question is the years. Is it 4 or 5? And then the last player in this tier, OG Anunoby. I talked about him extensively in my Knicks video. I think he gets between $35 to $40 million annually. I suppose he's available in the sense that if another team wants to blow him out of the water with a huge offer that the Knicks might not be comfortable paying him, then maybe he could be had. Like the Sixers can be aggressive in that sense if he wants, but I ultimately still expect him to return to the Knicks. Then I've got this sub-max tier, $30 to $35 million a year, only one player in it, James Harden. I think he's probably looking at like a Drew Holiday type deal, the type of extension Drew just did that's in the low 30s annually. And not that I think Harden's necessarily as impactful as Drew at this point in his career, but just as a reference, I think that's a pretty fair comp. And I just don't really see any other market for him. I think ultimately he ends up back with the Clippers on a pretty fair deal. And then the next year, 25 to 30 million annually. Wow, I spelled million wrong on that one. Only Emmanuel Quickly. And I think he's probably going to get closer to 25 million annually. It'd be pretty similar to what Anthony Simons just got. Probably not available. He's restricted. The Raptors traded OG Anunoby, a guy that they really didn't want to give up to get Quickly. And I'm sure they're already pretty close. Like, I'm sure they've been talking and they probably are pretty close to something. Maybe it gets announced within the next week or two. Next tier, $19 to $25 million annually. So far, all these tiers, the biggest thing in common is that you need cap space to get these players to sign them outright, or you need to have you already need to have had these players on your team, so you're re-signing them with the rights you have, or maybe you have enough flexibility to sign and trade for these guys. So the first one at the top, I've got Nick Claxton. I talked about his potential next deal in my Nets video. Definitely check that out. I think it's between $20 to $22 million annually. I think whatever he does the second year is going to be a decline to help the Nets maximize their 2025 cap space. And I ultimately think he probably ends up back with the Nets. Don't think it's a very strong center market. Hasn't been a good center market for free agents over the past 4 years. And I just think and all the reporting seems to indicate that they're pretty close to something. Next center, Isaiah Hartenstein. I think, so he's limited with the Knicks to 472. And I think that's pretty fair for considering what he's done. Could he get some more? Yeah, there's some reports, some rumors that maybe a team like the Thunder with cap space can offer a big front-loaded short-term deal, but we'll see. The Knicks cannot afford to lose him, but at the same time, there's not much they could do as far as being aggressive. They can only offer him a certain amount. I don't know what's going to happen, but if I had to predict, I think he ultimately stays. All right, Miles Bridges. I already talked about him earlier when I was talking about the Hornets. He is going to be unrestricted, so he's very much available. He has a lot of control in his destiny. One interesting type of structure I could see happening, Bobby Marks from ESPN noted it. Maybe he gets fair market value based on the production that he provides, but maybe gets a non-guaranteed deal on all the years aside from the first one, just so the team has some insurance. But he's pretty much available. But again, we'll see just how much interest there is around the league. DeMar DeRozan, I think he is very much available, but so far the reports indicate that he wants to return to the Bulls. And they can make an official extension. Now he is currently extension eligible. I can see him getting. Maybe he could get more than this, maybe closer to around what he's currently making, which was $28 million a year. But I also just don't really see where the market is quite for that. So maybe just gets like a slight pay cut. So D'Angelo Russell, I think it's kind of 50-50 at this point whether he becomes a free agent. There has been some reporting well before the playoffs started that he would opt out based on that really hot stretch he had. But I just don't know if some of the teams he's been linked to really make that much sense. And even if they truly do like him, it's unclear how much more they're willing to give him than what he's currently making. So I think there's actually a pretty good chance that he opts in. But even if he opts out, I think he would end up back with the Lakers on a short-term deal, maybe like just more years, 3 years, something like that, and a slightly higher salary. Klay Thompson seems to be extremely available now. There was some reporting that he is looking at all external options. He's been extension eligible with the Warriors for over a year now, and they haven't been able to agree to anything. It sounds like so there was a report that he agreed that last offseason he could have done a 2 for $48 extension, and he declined it. And now I don't know if that's what the Warriors are trying to go that high for. We'll see what happens. When I was projecting him, I had him getting around like 25 million a year, just to project a little on the higher end, but he could very well get the lower end of this, which is probably more what he's going to be worth going forward. And then Tobias Harris, yeah, he disappointed in his last few weeks as a Sixer, but just based on his position and skill set, he's probably still going to get a pretty fair salary going forward. And he's very much available. I don't know who would be interested, but I also would not completely rule out a return to the Sixers, just in case they completely strike out on their top targets. Two more tiers left. And these players, unless I note otherwise, they're very much available. These players, a lot more easier to obtain. Unlike the players that I was just talking about earlier, they're more expensive, harder to get if you're another team. So here's the first tier, $13 to $19 million annually. Pretty big range in there, but it's basically above the mid-level exception. To like, if you want to get these guys, you got to pay more than that. And let's start with, I think, the best player of this group, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. So he has that $15 million player option that he's expected to decline, and he's probably going to get a higher annual salary and a long-term deal. I think he's like in his early 30s, so this could be one of his last big deals. So he'll need to capitalize, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of teams interested. I think Orlando, Philadelphia could make a lot of sense for him. However, I just don't think Denver can afford to lose him. If his salary starts to get into the 20 million range, like low 20s, I think you got to match that anyways. If you're Denver, you'll be deep into the tax, whatever that's already baked in to keep this team together. The question is, can they maybe make some trades later to just get below those second apron and avoid those draft pick penalties in the future? There is a possibility where they can keep them and avoid that in the future. So Malik Monk arguably could have been in the last tier, but I just kind of think ultimately he ends up back with the Kings, taking the most that they can offer him, 4 for $78. That's somewhat of a contrarian opinion that a lot of Kings fans, when I did my Kings video, believe that no, like there's no way Malik Monk's taking that. He's worth more, and he'll probably join a cap space team like Orlando or Detroit. We'll see. Obviously, very available. He's unrestricted, and he should be a pretty hot commodity. We'll see what happens, though. I still think he ends up back with the Kings. Caleb Martin has a $7.1 million player option. He's going to decline it. That's too low for him, especially based on what he did in last year's playoffs. Didn't quite reach those levels in this year's playoffs, but was still way more effective than a $7 million player. He could very well double his salary going forward, and he'll definitely get contract offers starting at the non-tax pyramid level that starts at 13 million and goes up. I could see him getting more in a sign and trade too. If you look what Miami did last offseason with Max Strus, Gabe Vincent, they were more than willing to participate in sign and trades where they just got some draft picks back, and maybe they can do the same thing for Caleb Martin, which would allow him to get a little more than the mid-level exception. So Obi Toppin, he's restricted, so immediately very unlikely to be moved just because of that. It's very hard for these players to move around in free agency. I think he probably ends up back with the Pacers just because I think I mentioned in this video, I don't think they're going to get a better player for the mid-level than him. But I could see him potentially getting signed and traded, or the Pacers just letting him go if another team comes out with a really aggressive offer. Like I'm talking $18 to $20 million a year. I think Pacers probably hoping to keep him around like 13 to 15 million annually. I think that's pretty reasonable for him, especially if he's gonna not start at best. So we'll see what happens there. I just don't really see the market for a team to really go with that type of aggressive offer to steal him, though. So Tyus Jones, he's unrestricted, and the Wizards got him as a centerpiece of their trade for Kristaps Porzingis. And I think the whole nucleus there was they were hoping to parlay him into a first round pick or something of value in a trade. That didn't happen, and he was never extension eligible, so he's hitting unrestricted free agency. I think they'd like to resign him, but they'd also be open to sign and trade opportunities if they can get the value that they want now. I think the Anthony Melton might be one of the most underrated players in the free agency market. He had an amazing start to the season last year with the Sixers taking over for James Harden as soon as they traded him, helped the Sixers get off to a great start. And then as the season progressed, he started getting some injuries. And now it seems like I thought early on he was looking like, like a 16 to 18-ish million dollar player annually. Now this injury seems to have dropped the stock. He might be looking at getting the full mid-level and maybe slightly higher than that. So if it doesn't seem like the Sixers are going to prioritize him at all unless they really strike out on targets. But if another team can get him for the full mid-level, I think that they're looking at getting a pretty good bargain there. So Bruce Brown, I talked about him earlier when I was talking about the Raptors. We still don't know whether he's going to be a free agent. I think they should make him a free agent. If he does, he's probably looking at mid-level offers. And if they keep him, they'll probably look to trade him. So Bojan Bogdanovic, also 50-50 as far as whether he'll become a free agent. He's got a small partial guarantee. I believe it's $3 million. And the Knicks brought him in for this year particularly. However, I talked about his situation in my Knicks video, and I think there's a good chance that they keep him for trade purposes mainly. Because if a star player becomes available, his $19 million salary would come in handy towards the salary matching component. Because you have that salary, then that lets you keep more of your other role players, your Josh Harts, your Mitchell Robinsons, Dante DiVincenzo's, those level of players that you need to add towards a star trade to make the salaries work. So they could potentially waive him, and if he is available, it's probably looking at mid-level type offers. So Chris Paul's got that $30 million completely non-guaranteed salary. The most likely scenario is that they cut him. Maybe they keep him, or more so push his guarantee date, which is at the end of June, maybe further into July, to see if any trade opportunities arise where they can get an expensive all-star. Unlikely that happens. A lot of luck needs to go their way for that type of scenario to arise. But I'm sure Chris Paul would agree to it. It worked out for him last year, where he was in the same situation and got the guaranteed raise, eventually fully guaranteed, to facilitate the Bradley Beal trade and the Jordan Poole trade shortly after. But if he's available, I would think at the highest end he's looking at the mid-level, maybe a team like the Spurs willing to shell out whatever cap space they have to get him if they think he'd be great with Victor Wembanyama. So maybe he gets a little more than that, but I would say he's probably more realistically looking at the mid-level and maybe even less if available. So Saddiq Bey's a player who, coming into his extension eligibility last summer, I thought he was probably going to project to be like a high teens annually type of player. And he couldn't get an extension done with the Hawks, went to the season, did not really progress, and then unfortunately had this injury. So that's going to hurt his stock and also his potential options. He's restricted. So the Hawks have a lot of control on this situation. I think I would still be pretty comfortable giving him slightly above the mid-level at this point, maybe for multiple years. I still think there's a good player there, just needs to recover from this injury, and I think there's a good player there waiting to be unlocked. And then Buddy Hield, the player who was pretty difficult for me to figure out where to place him, because he has been making around I think he just made like around $18 million this last season. It was a descending contract, and you would think, okay, you should, if he was to make around the same, that's pretty fair. But where's that market? Where are those offers coming from right now? I don't really see it. And he's probably, I would guess he's probably looking at mid-level type offers, and hopefully uh, there's a sign and trade situation where the Sixers can trade him. He could get a little more money than that, and it's very possible he does get that type of scenario situation happening, because the Sixers are going to be trying to get. They're going to look at every possible scenario. If they miss out on the Paul Georges, maybe they can try to trade for Brandon Ingram. And then the final tier, $8 to $13 million players. So basically up to the full mid level, and then that, which just starts at 13 million, and then 8 million. That is the Rube mid level exception, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the exception that teams over the cap get. So that's the range. And this would be the final tier of my top 40 guys. So Kelly Oubre, I talked about his situation in my Sixers video. There's been a lot of speculation that, or even not speculation, a lot of people, when they're kind of projecting what the Sixers roster could look like, they're penciling him to take that $8 million Rube mid level. I don't think that's going to be enough for him. He made a lot of strides last year, and I think he's one of the more gettable wings, especially with the Sixers situation. They're trying to just get upgrades everywhere, and he's very gettable. And I could see a team throwing the full mid level at him to steal him. Derrick Jones Jr., he broke out this year, was just kind of bouncing around teams, and he always had the tools, the athleticism to be a good NBA player. It just never could come together, and finally did in Dallas. And it was interesting seeing his stock rise throughout this playoff run. And he went from a guy where maybe the Mavs try to keep him on a 1 year deal to get a little more right so they can pay him fairly next year, to no, this guy's going to want to get paid now, and he's going to get those type of offers. I think he could get up to the full mid level, maybe not the full amount, but he's going to get pretty close to it. I think the Mavs are going to have some challenges towards trying to resign him, but they could make it happen. Royce O'Neal, another one of those wing players that should be somewhat coveted in the market, could go up for the full mid level, but I don't think he's going to be as available as some of these guys in this tier, because the Suns in a way cannot afford to lose him. They gave up 3 second round picks to get him, and they have no option to replace him if he leaves. They'll just have minimum contracts because of those second apron restrictions. They can only replace him with more minimum players. In that sense, though, some other team could make a pretty aggressive offer that's above the mid-level range if they really wanted to troll the Suns and steal him. So Jonas Valanciunas, I would say he's very much available. I don't think he'll go back to New Orleans. They're looking for new center options. I could see him getting the full mid-level exception, which would be a slight pay cut from what he's been currently making. He maybe could get even less than that. And at this point, he could be a high-end backup going forward. Isaac Okoro, like Obi Toppin, is a restricted free agent, and in a way is gettable if another team wants to shell out a really aggressive offer that the Cavs might blink at. But I don't see any team really making like that aggressive of an offer. So I ultimately do see the Cavs keeping him if if they really want to keep him. Najee Marshall, as I mentioned earlier, sneaky good player who could get stolen by another team if the Pelicans can't get their payroll situation in order. He can get up to the full mid level. A lot of people might think that might be too much. Maybe gets closer to that 8 million room mid level, but either way, he's going to get something in that range. Isaiah Joe, talked about him in my Thunder video. I think there's a very good chance that they either decline him, make him a free agent, a restricted free agent, and then re-sign him to a new deal that is team friendly, helps them be able to keep him later as the team gets more expensive, or they might just opt him in and extend him. Simone Fontecchio, touched on him earlier with the Pistons. He can get honestly more than this. He can get like around $15-16 million a year with his early bird rights, with what the Pistons can offer him. But just based on the production, he's more closer to this tier so far. So Gary Trent at best at this point might be a full mid-level exception player, which is a lot less than the $18 million a year he was making. His stock has fallen quite a bit over the years, and he's very available. If anything, I don't really think he'll be heading back to Toronto. Patrick Williams, I touched on him earlier. And again, a lot of it depends on what the Bulls' payroll situation is like. They might not be able to fit him in with the rest of the roster already being pretty expensive. So another team could swoop in with a pretty aggressive offer sheet and steal him. I think Precious Achua only stays with the Knicks if they lose Isaiah Hardenstein. Either way, though, whether it's with them or another team, I could see him getting around the $8 million room mid-level exception. I think that's a pretty fair starting point for him. Haywood's Highsmith, also, I could see him getting up to the room mid-level. There's a lot of people probably think maybe closer to the tax pyramid level, 5 million, but I think he's worth more than that. Maybe not to the Heat. I could see them letting him go if offers get to that amount because of their payroll issues and their desire likely to keep their flexibility open in case a star trade does become available. So Spencer Dinwiddie, he's probably worth the full mid-level exception. It'd be pretty comparable to Dennis Schroeder getting it last year on a 2-year deal. It's going to be a lot less than what he's been making, around 18 to 20 million dollars in the past few years. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets something in the lower end of this range. Kyle Anderson, also, I see him getting in the lower end of this range. He made $9 million last year. I think he'll probably get around that same amount, maybe a little less. I don't know. He's a hard player to kind of figure out because it's it's kind of tricky where he can be a good fit. But he can easily be gettable for any team given Minnesota's salary cap situation. And then Gary Harris, who I think is a sneaky good player. I think he's got his injury problems, but when he's healthy, he's just a solid guy. And maybe doesn't get the full mid level because of those injury issues, but I think that whichever team gets him, doesn't seem like Orlando will really prioritize him, but whichever team gets him, I think could be getting a pretty good steal. And that will conclude my 2024 free agency primer slash guide slash preview, whatever you want to call it. This was a lot of fun for me to do. Really dove into everything. If you want a lot more info on what I've done, please go back and watch my videos on each team. I've done about 17 or 18 teams. You can see more in-depth looks on the teams and the players that I touched on in this video. Overall, I don't think this is the strongest free agency market. I think we're going to get a lot more fireworks and trades. The salary cap, it's not going up that much. It's only going up about 4%. That projection doesn't seem to have changed, and that's a smaller increase from last year that went up 10%. And there's even less talent available that's that are going to become free agents, and that's actually available that could potentially move teams. So on the free agent market, I don't think it's going to be that exciting, relatively speaking, but we will see how the trade market develops. And once again, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure to check out capsheets.com at this time of year. I'm going to be updating the website a lot in real time as transactions happen, and make sure to follow me on all social media, especially on Twitter, on just my name, Yossi Goslin. I will be reacting to transactions as they happen with all the salary cap analysis as well in real time.